are recording today's session, and it is also broadcasting live to Facebook. So welcome, and I want to take just a quick moment to introduce our special guest, Paula Ellis. Paula is focused right now on civic entrepreneurship, and she has an extensive career as a journalist and has worked in both profit and nonprofit organizations. And Paula, we're so pleased that you could join us today, and we look forward to learning from you.
Thank you.
So, John, it's all yours.
Paula, it's wonderful that you could join us. And with the kind of background you have, I think we're going to learn an awful lot. I know that you edited newspapers and been a key person in the major foundation, the Knight Foundation, and you're a senior associate at the Kettering Foundation. And more credentials, I'm sure, that I don't know of. But with that kind of a career, I wonder if we could start by asking, having that kind of experience in the newspaper, at least, world, and more broadly the media, tell us how it's affected where you stand today and your understanding of the media and its role.
Okay, great. Thank you. First of all, thank you both for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be in a conversation with you two gentlemen who I've learned from also all along in my career. It might be useful if I just say a few words about myself that help maybe to see that we've been not knowing each other, but living in parallel universes in a sense. So I was raised in Washington, D.C., in a progressive Catholic family, and had the benefit of reading this columnist, a guy named Nicholas von Hoffman, who wrote pretty endlessly about this place called the Woodlawn Organization, which sounded, pretty enchanting. I have an undergraduate degree in government and politics, and my journalism career has always been one where I'm very interested in who has power, who doesn't have power, and how the world could be jointly shaped. So I think that orientation. I also had the great good fortune to work 26 years with a news organization called Knight Ridder, where we really talked about community well-being and could our newspapers be an agent of community well-being. I know that's not always apparent to people, but so it's an orientation that I've had for quite a while. And so I guess now, what I would just say about the current state of affairs is the industry or the news business, whatever you want to call it, news, not even, it's in many ways, it's not a business anymore, but is at a pretty significant inflection point. Some would say, oh, this is a platelet shift. Everything we once knew is dramatically changing. Others might say new species are emerging, but it certainly is a wonderfully exciting time, which brings with it opportunity and threats. And I think we see a fair amount of all of those. My personal hope and sort of whatever I can help in the world to nudge things is to sort of see if the systems that are emergent can be better than the ones that are being destroyed.
Could you be specific about
one of your
Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, Peter.
Emergent and destroyed? How would you name those two domains?
Well, I think what's being destroyed, the fundamental challenge to, let's just call it news organizations, is an economic one, which is that the way to pay for the collection and distribution of news is changing dramatically, or is eroding. The platforms on which news is being distributed and constructed are all changing and constantly being reinvented. And what we have today is, if anyone took the time to read the piece that was shared, everybody has voice, and everybody has an opportunity now to get their voice out there from a distribution point of view. What we have now is a war for attention. And so people are working really very hard to aggregate attention. So as the sort of Uber system that, I would say kind of monopolized media for good and ill, the sort of, what would you call it, the mass media becomes more and more of a series of niches. There's more opportunity and threat. I don't know if that's helpful.
It is very helpful. Thank you.
You say in an article you wrote that the media has shifted from what it was, perhaps giving us information, to taking on roles of enculturation and socialization. And I wonder if you could tell us what that means specifically.
Yeah. So, in prior, I won't go into the history of media. It did start out as opinion and propaganda, you might call it, but it evolved to a point where it was early on almost stenography, almost like an extension of the telegraph. Like Ernie Pyle would send us a dispatch because we weren't able to be there. We weren't able to know whether was it propaganda or truth. It's what we had, and in many ways we accepted it as truth. And then as communities became more complex, competition got greater, the journalist duties moved more to a recognition that we were really instrumental in establishing societal norms. So let me try to be less oblique. So the current platform for journalism was tools developed out of the period of enlightenment and the age of reason, and that fundamental idea that if citizens have knowledge, they will do the right thing. And Kettering would throw in, they'll deliberate and do the right thing. But the idea was that they would do the right thing. And or if they weren't going to be able, if institutions weren't working for us, weren't doing the right thing, journalism could sort of in an up against the wall way expose what was wrong with the institution and cause the institutions to respond, hopefully, for good. Now the challenges that we face are way more complex than that. And our society is much more pluralistic. So, for example, and so I would always say that journalism the controversies aren't about facts. They're about values collisions at the intersection. So, for example, when I was being an editor in Columbia, South Carolina, Knight Ridder, the company I worked with, we made a corporate decision that we were going to be the first in the country to run same-sex wedding announcements. Now, you can imagine this in conservative Columbia, South Carolina. The place was up for grabs because what we were doing was challenging a norm, changing a norm. So the things that appeared in media help to sort of say who's in and who's out, and that's where we have so much trouble. What's normative, what's not normative, back when it was a mass business.
Let me try to redefine what's happened and see what you think of this. When I was young, we lived in Columbus, Ohio, and both of the newspapers were owned by a very conservative family, the Wolf family. Mm-hmm. And my father and their editorial policy was manifest on the front page and all other pages. So that's the information that we received. Incidentally, behind me, I have a big rubber stamp that my father had made. And if you'll pardon me, it says bullshit. And he would take this rubber stamp, and after he read an article in the newspaper, the Wolf newspaper in Columbus, he'd stamp it with that stamp, right, to certify that it was an inaccurate portrayal of his reality. Now, there was one voice, in a sense, back then. And now what we have, you could say in a wonderful democratic way, more ways for people to give voice than you could possibly imagine. And the victim of that may just be newspapers. So what's wrong with the democratization of voices that we have now?
Yeah. I'm not so sure anything is wrong with it. So I'm not ever going to be a defender of the industry or the business, because it was deeply flawed in that so many people were left out. And you're talking about just a political persuasion. Women were left out, African American, all kind. It was never a complete picture of society. So I don't want to sort of, falsely idealize it. And so and so now what we can see is maybe the First Amendment wasn't just written for the press. It was written for Americans. And there's an opportunity for citizens to also fully embrace their First Amendment rights. Now, the challenge is with this cacophony of voices, and by the way, the world is not full of all good doers. I think we know that. We can see that people who want to create bedlam and menace often are the first, or make a lot of money, are the first to adapt these tools. But with the means of production being democratized, we have a chance, I think, to tell more complete stories. The challenge is, how is it going to aggregate up? So I'm a big fan of Martin Buber, I and Thou, so that journalism as a political scientist, journalism was what we called a mediating institution, meaning we bridged from the I to the other. So that's how we were trained. We bridge from the I to the other, and the other to the I, and that the individual can't know themselves, but to know themselves in relationship with community and and like that. And that's what journalism was able to do, with many flaws. But as the networks now are kind of falling apart and becoming maybe echo chambers and people not bridging out, that's the biggest risk. So there's a risk that you could have more voices, but what's materializing at this point is that people generally like to stay in their sort of tribal loyalties, have their belief systems reinforced. This is the mad genius of Roger Ailes and the creation of Fox News, because what they know is that if you reinforce someone's belief system, they'll act. If you ask them to bridge out and understand the other, it is too much often. So that's why the news systems are going in this tribal way to some degree.
Peter?
The major institutions are still very powerful. People say everybody buys online. Well, it's not true. 21% of the people buy online. They say print books are going out of print. Well, it's not true. They're growing. The electronic books plateaued. And I asked the mayor of Cincinnati once, I bet his father was a mayor, and I said, I'm thinking of starting a newspaper. And he says, well, I want the most powerful job there. I want the job deciding what constitutes news. And when we talk about a narrative shifting, you're talking about the distribution system, which is very interesting. But I'm wondering, when will we shift what constitutes news? When will we get away from saying, if I cover the extremes, I've offered both sides? And it still feels to me like there's an opportunity there, or a shift in consciousness. For example, is something small and neighborly news? Right now it's called human interest, which means if you want something small, local, and neighborly, you write it yourself and send it in and see if they have the space. And I kind of have the hope and the illusion and the romantic desire that we decide that what bleeds does not lead.
Right.
Any thoughts about seeing where that shift might be occurring you know, and I know by civic entrepreneurship, maybe civic journalism was a movement for a while. I'd just like to get your thoughts, Paula, about openings you see or opportunities or.
Great. So you never ask a simple question. I think to break it apart a little bit.
Thank you.
I think that there are a lot of journalists and there are a lot of experimenters who recognize the destructive nature of some of the routines of journalism. And those are the kinds of individuals I'm privileged to work with at Kettering. And so some of those routines are the first one that you recognize, which you say is that there are two sides to a story, and and then therefore we see the world as polarized, we promulgate polarization, and then we wonder, why is the world polarized? One of the things we're trying to, although I will say journalists are acted on by other actors. Journalists aren't generally the protagonist. They're usually being acted on by all kinds of other forces. But one of the things I'm working with some folks at Kettering about is thinking on, okay, so the opposite of conflict and two-sided stories maybe isn't many-sided stories. It may be something else. And the ideas that I've been pursuing and with some others are much more about something that we're calling relational journalism, that connection and relation. Because what we're able to see is that people are more willing to believe or trust what you're saying if they're in a relationship with you of care and trust, if they kind of trust where you're coming from. That's very different than being in a fact-based business. So that's one kind of node of activity. Another area, I'm sorry.
Give me just a sample of, if I believe that, what would it lead me to do? What kind of story, what kind of, would I start creating to build that trust and relationship? Is it a more nuanced story, a subtle story, an innocent story, experiential story?
Yeah. First, it's probably an orientation before one can even imagine what the story is. So the orientation, this idea of objectivity was very dangerous and damaging to journalism. It was an economic idea, by the way. It wasn't a journalist idea. It was created as news organizations were monopolizing markets. So what it created was an orientation of distance, and the idea that you had to be distant, objective, scientific, third-person narrative, alienated almost.
Yes.
Once you have like a sort of a scientific rationalism on steroids. So once you have that orientation, you experience the world very differently than if you have an orientation that says, I'm okay, I'm comfortable saying, I care about my community. I can stake ground on that. I don't get to decide what happens, but I can at least say I care. It used to be some editors said they didn't even vote. Oh, for God's sakes. So that whole distancing I think we're seeing a whole thing about it. Now, as a specific example, there's an organization that we're working with at Kettering called Spaceship Media, which is truly fascinating. They host dialogues. They do it mostly through Facebook across highly polarized lines, and they're learning like all kinds of things. Just awesome. About the value of the dialogue. When people ask the reporter for a fact, they believe the fact more than if the fact is more dumped on them. So that's one. Another huge and growing organization that I think is wonderful to watch is Solutions Journalism.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
And they have the idea. That problems are solvable. One of the challenges is we've created this master narrative that stuff will be forever screwed up and cannot be fixed. That's just not true. That's just not true.
Right.
And so they've come out with, can we give examples of where communities have fixed things? One, to inspire them, but two, some of the ideas are transferable. So those are two examples.
That's great. I love the language. You know, like the idea of poverty is solvable.
Yeah.
And that is such a radical thought. And, you know, Van Jones strikes me as a celebrity type.
Oh, yeah.
If I watch him, I'm fascinated. He really does try to give voice to build a relationship with people with a different point of view.
He does. You know, there was one other thing, Peter, I wanted to say in
Yeah.
response to your question is one thing, and I would welcome the thoughts of all the folks on the phone or wherever they are, is a metaphor for storytelling is the hero's journey, right? We're all familiar with it. And even you look back in history and everything's attributed to Martin Luther King, that he didn't, you know, it takes a lot of us acting sometimes in concert. Sometimes we don't even know each other's acting, and then things tip, right? You know, there's not a journalistic way to tell that story. That's one sort of just very practical thing I'm trying to sort of think about. It's pretty easy to look backwards and tell a story and, you know, hang it on one person.
I know, but it's that spark, something was there long before the spark.
Right, and it misleads people about how change happens.
And it leads us to look for the next hero, which has its own dangers. And journalism, you know, for the common good, probably should be careful with heroes.
Yes, I'm hoping you guys can figure this out for us.
Well, that's why we invited you. I think it's a big deal because I just love what you're saying and how you're thinking about it, and Kettering's supporting it. Because I know how I see you determines how I treat you. And as John has demonstrated for 40 years, that if I see you as a deficiency, then I will try to fix you. If I see you as a gift, then I will try to join you. And everything shifts in that. And I just feel your profession is such, like you say, a participant in how we see each other. And the fact that all the things you're saying are just beautifully radical and compassionate all at the same time. I really appreciate it, Paula. Really.
Thank you.
Well, I think the relational idea, the connective tissue, is critical. The Asset-Based Community Development Institute that we're associated with has always had that as the central question. I want to, though, ask about a function that newspapers, I think, have or could perform from a neighborhood perspective. And it's this. I remember some years ago gathering most of the leaders of the neighborhood organizations in Chicago. And we had a day-long discussion. And the question was, what would newspapers report if it was helpful to you? And then you could see that at the end of the day, there was an agenda of what people need to know if they're going to be effective citizens. And it struck me that that function of something called the media is really critical for local people. And I wonder what your think is about where are we going to, in our neighborhoods, get that kind of information that will allow us to know what's coming toward us, know what the possibilities are, that kind of thing.
Right. I don't say this glibly, but I think you might have to grow your own. And I say that with all respect, because there hasn't been an economic model to underpin news production. Certainly news production of that sort has not been found. I mean, the most expensive news was local news, local news. And so I think that if we take, you know, some of the ideas that we talk about at Kettering with you, John, and others, like a real co-production idea toward it, and invent kind of our own community systems. It doesn't, I know people don't believe this when I say it, but I go, news does not have to be a business. It could be a gift economy. I mean, it could be all kinds of things. It was a business for a while, but it doesn't have to be. And the fact that there's not revenue to support it is a challenge. So I think that kind of, but then it has to be networked so that you do have journalists or others who can get into the power positions to find out the secrets that city council has before they're about to land a toxic waste dump across the street from your house. So there has to be some kind of a networked approach. I worked with some folks to try out some of these ideas on something called the Milwaukee Neighborhood News Network. It continues, it goes on. It was, I won't get into all the ins and outs of it, but I spent a lot of time working with them on, these were in 5, challenged, difficult communities where all the master narrative about them was always something horrible. The stories. So one piece of the challenge is, what's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves? One, we all know that in our own head, that we can know what's the story we're feeding to ourselves. What's the story we're feeding to each other as a group? What's the story we're feeding to each other, as a neighborhood block? And getting a handle on those stories, I think, is really important. The Neighborhood News Network was efforting to do some of that, for us to identify what are the resources, the talents that we have in this community, write about them, show them, blah, blah. It becomes a contagion. And before you might know it, optimism is spiraling up rather than down. We're having optimism, not pessimism. But what happened in this work, and the work goes on, what was really important was that the community members were like, oh, that's sort of whizzy bang. I mean, I was like, well, you can identify and frame news based on what's relevant to you and what you care about. But what it turns out that people mostly wanted was the acknowledgement of the bigger whole. They wanted the correct narrative about them in the Metro Daily. They were still grieving deeply their misrepresentation, and all of which reminded me of the power of just giving witness. Journalism witnesses things, and maybe we're witnessing kind of the wrong things. I'll say one other thing is, right there, John, you provoked this. Right there in your city, I don't know if you know City Bureau. Yeah. This astounding man, Daryl Holliday, who every time I talk to him, I'm like, oh my God, my head just wants to spin around. He's so smart. And what he's got is what he calls monitorial journalists, but what he's got is a network of people from the communities who he's training to do journalism, and then they're kind of moving up the engagement chain, if you would. But it's and so also they're using journalism as an on-ramp to civic participation. That doing journalism is also a civic act.
And so if somebody wanted to check that out, they go to the internet and look at
citybureau.org, I think, or .com, I'm not sure, but it's City Bureau in Chicago.
And then what about the Milwaukee?
That's the Milwaukee Neighborhood News Network. Same, if you Google, you'll find it. It's now based permanently at Marquette University. It was a highly collaborative setup between foundations, the university, and local media.
This is so great. Becky, maybe now is the time to invite people. Those links are on the chat if anybody would like to look at them. Leslie's posting them.
Sure. So now what we'd like to do is welcome folks in groups of 3. If you'd like to raise your hand, and we can bring you on as panelists to talk live with Paula and John and Peter. And so we'll give you a moment to do that. And while we're waiting, there was a question that had come in the chat earlier that perhaps the 3 of you want to discuss while we're waiting for folks who want to raise their hand. The hand raise function is in your Zoom panel. So we had a question come in. How do journalists go about building relationships with people who follow them? Any thoughts on that?
I guess that's for me to start.
Yeah, I think so.
I think maybe it would be different relationships. So journalists over time became more aligned with experts, institutional leaders, people who nominate themselves to speak for a large group of people, whether you know they do or not. They've nominated themselves to be the spokesperson. So we know those people, they're all in the Rolodex. What it takes to develop the relationship is just to cultivate a journalist. I used to use the old Jesse Jackson, each one reach one. Journalists are, generally approachable human beings. And they got into the business to make things better. And so I think just cultivating someone, it's not good to only call them when you have something that you want them to do for you and they don't do it and you're ticked off. That doesn't work well. That really doesn't work well. And the cultivation for folks who this might be, the cultivation is not just like spot on about your business, about your enterprise or your NGO. It's about kind of the world broadly. Be an informed source for them. Help them go into places and understand things that they can't know without a wise guide. Become that indispensable source. You might not be named very often, but then when you want something, you're likely to get it.
I think there's a reporter named Lucy May in Cincinnati. And I didn't realize what I was doing until I just listened to you, Paula. But when I see something, I just call her. And more often, that's it. I just listen, there's something going on at the public housing, there's something going on in the neighborhood, and she shows up and does a story, and I just so appreciate her. And I should take that on as something I did it by accident because she showed up first. But I think that's a great notion, is to build those relationships without an objective even. It's just you help them see what you care about.
There's no quid pro quo.
Exactly.
You and I both are trying to make our community better. And let me just share with you some things from where I walk and talk.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So, Paula, this might seem like a strange question, but I'm hearing Peter say to pick up the phone. As it relates to cultivating relationships, have you found that there's one channel that's more effective than another? I'm sure journalists are inundated with email. A lot of journalists use Twitter, or they're on Facebook, or they're on LinkedIn. So do you have any sense from your experience about the best ways to approach that relationship building process?
Well, so I think it's like everything, right? Nothing replaces face-to-face human contact. Nothing replaces that as a foundation for building. And I know that's not always possible, but it's probably more possible than we think. And emails, people just get a bazillion emails. They don't know you from anybody. So I would say, just in person, invite the person out for a cup of coffee or something. If they have a beat and you know where they're going to be, go there. If they're not on deadline, talk to them afterwards and say, hey, I'd love to do a follow-up with you. And then once you have a relationship, then it's easy to exchange by email and all the other kind of things.
Thanks, Paula. So I want to mention again that we are willing to bring you on camera today if you would like to talk directly with Peter and John and Paula. And you can use the hand raise function on the Zoom panel, and we'll go ahead and invite you on camera to talk with us. If you prefer to not be on camera, we can also go ahead and just give you audio access. So I have John who's wanting to join us, and I'm going to go ahead and add him. We can take a couple more. So I'm inviting now John and also New Scoop YY.
Sarah. Right.
Oh, is that Sarah? Okay, welcome.
Hi, John.
John, you're muted. You're going to want to unmute, as is Sarah. So, John, if you want to share first.
Yeah, I always show up for these just because I'm always stimulated and inspired and challenged. My passion is actually something a little different, which is trying to change culture in big corporations. But something that really inspired me was the idea that problems are solvable and changing that narrative. Because so often we hear, big corporations are always ruthlessly profit-driven and don't care about communities. They don't care about their own people that work in them. So I guess just more thanks for that inspiration about the importance of changing the language and the narrative and thinking about how to do that with more probably internal media, but nonetheless, thank you.
Thank you, John. Sarah, would you like to share?
Yes, and I'm sorry you can't see my face. I realized when I pushed the button to come on that, my computer has blanked out the video option for me. So I am a friendly person, really. But Paula, it's lovely to be able to hear your stories from, huge experience of journalism. And I am really taken and struck by trying to understand more of what you mean by relational journalism. And perhaps to help make it concrete, I'm curious if you have examples about journalism that has been written from someone who's strong, competent, confident in their I care position. Like, what does that actually look like when you see it in print? And can you give us examples of that kind of journalism that you've, witnessed or about?
I don't have any at the ready, but I think you see them whenever you read an article or a magazine piece where you can feel how empathic it is. I personally, in all the years I was hiring journalists, thought the most important characteristic was their ability to have empathy. The rest is just sort of like auto mechanics. I'd have to find some articles and share them, which I would be happy to do. And on this idea of relational journalism, I'm just kind of working it out in my head and starting to try to work it out on paper. So with two co-authors, we have a contract to write a journalism textbook. And we're efforting to articulate a new normative theory for journalism. And this is one of the elements of it that I'm still trying to work out. But one thing about, if it were relational, it would be framed in a way that was useful to you, that you would recognize the issues. Currently, things generally are framed from experts or from in the language of policy. They're written in a language that is not really recognizable to very many people. And so, again, if I were in a relational, I would be, we used to have a cliche, right, as if you're writing a letter to an intelligent friend, but they don't speak all that jargon. I think it would be really to just fundamentally change where we start when we're starting a new story, to listen really carefully to the way people in the public think and talk and frame an issue and come at it from there versus the way policy wonks talk about it. That would be one big shift.
That's great.
Thank you.
Mary, would you like to speak? You're muted right now. Welcome.
Mary's from Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all and hear you, particularly Paula. Fascinating insights to the world of journalism. I suppose what I just wanted to share is, building on your points about cultivating relationships with journalists, and a little story from Derry from about 6 years ago, when the benefit of being, I suppose, in a small place where we have been able to get to know our journalists, both newsprint and radio and also television, absolutely came up trumps in a campaign which was very short and sharp. And the powers that be had decided to spend some unexpected money that had come into the city ahead of us being the first UK City of Culture in 2013. This money had come in to upgrade our streets. And in their wisdom, they decided they would spend the money pulling out our old historic cast iron street lights, lamp posts, and put in new modern galvanized steel lamp posts. And we were able to feed, I suppose, the facts on the value and significance of these old lights. So they were the only collection of historic street lights left in any city or town in Northern Ireland, and possibly on the island of Ireland. And to cut the very long story short, we are fortunate to have a BBC radio station in Derry, BBC Radio Foyle, and its afternoon discussion programme carried a 10-minute interview in the street, which then kind of started like a domino effect with journalists in newspapers, one of whom was a neighbour of my own, who was able to get the story onto the front page of the regional Belfast Telegraph. It was then carried by the local papers in Derry over a period of about 3 or 4 days. Local television turned up. It went out on television across Northern Ireland that Sunday, and 2 more heavyweight interviews from one of our leading investigative journalists, Eamon McCann, really kind of put the thing to bed. So within about 10 days, the 2 government departments involved had done a complete U-turn, and we ended up saving the cast iron street lights in the rest of the city and repairing 5 of the ones that had been pulled out. So it's just a little story, but I kind of was gobsmacked at the effectiveness of all these journalists who all came together. Like, it was like Jane Jacobs talks about a ballet on a sidewalk. Well, this was a ballet of journalists.
Great story.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, Mary, that was a beautiful story, and you perfectly described how news moves through the ecosystem of news. You know, like a little goldfish and then a bigger guppy. You know, it moves. So that's how they grow often and become big stories.
Yeah.
So, Becky, why don't we thank the 3 of you? John, nice to see you again. And Sarah, I know you're there. And Mary, thanks so much.
Yes. And we do have some other folks who are ready to come on. I'm going to add those other folks first, and then I'll dismiss our current guests. And thank you so much for participating. And welcome now to Gary and to Frankie Lee. And
Hi, Gary. Frankie's laying on her side.
I didn't mean to be so in the dark here.
You know, Paula, while we're waiting, I think the story of the evolving what's happening in journalism in itself is a mesmerizing story. You know, I just think the fact that the questions you're raising and the language you're introducing is in itself an amazing invitation to those of us that are working in communities and stuff like that. Because I felt that I had to take it on myself, and I did for a while. And then I backed off at the last minute because I felt I didn't have the commitment to do it. But knowing now that you can give me 5 or 10, you know, I can imagine a GoFundMe structure around news and stuff that's probably evolving. So I just think it's wonderful to hear.
Well, the world is catching up to your idea. And I always remember Steve Johnson, when he writes about innovation, one thing he talks about is spare parts. The challenge is you can have an idea long before the parts to pull it together exist.
I know. Anyway, this is great to hear. So let's hear from Frankie, and hi, Gary. And then we're going to maybe just these 2, Becky.
okay, and you will need to unmute, please, folks, if you want to speak.
Frankie Lee.
Yes. If you can go ahead and use the unmute, or Gary, if you want to start first.
She did it.
Okay, perfect.
I'm on a cell phone. That's why I ended up sideways to start. Well, we've spoken before. So hello, Peter. Hello, John. And I'm very happy to meet you, Paula. That was one of the most just easy to understand representations of journalism as I've experienced it through my life, and I'll turn a lot of people on to this broadcast as a result. I have crossed over now, living in over 200 homes in 7.5 years on the road, after 20 some years growing the story of the art of living. And the notion is that we're the artists of our lives, and we took it into a living model for a project called Circles Uniting. And we've been narrating the story in small ways all the way along towards taking it to a larger form. So this is a beautiful time to be together, but rather than talk about it, the reason I wanted to call in was that it really does work with the principles that we're speaking to today. It's about showing process, actually the living of our lives and what it takes to move into community and to orient to what's right about our being together. The sense that like Peter is an artist of life, and that makes possible that someone else as well, someone who lives in their gifts, who contributes naturally, and who is supported in it in life, and that we can be creative about where we're coming from with one another, different than circumstances delegating things that we simply can deal with. So it's a way to bring consciousness into the mainstream in a way that's very, very practical and proven, because this many people, 6 states, 200 homes, 7.5 years, and I'm still standing to tell the story. So I would love to be able to grow this conversation with all of you, because frankly, I'm aware that I'm at this point the poster girl for what not to do, which is that I'm too much out on my own. And I really do need help to bring this story out, because I don't know all the ingredients, but I would love to share how it shines light on the very things and makes possible.
Thank you, Frankie. Is it Frankie or Frankie Lee?
Frankie Lee.
Okay,
Frankie
good.
Lee.
I don't want to leave out the second. Thank you very much for that kind of poetic expression. Appreciate it. Gary, you want to say something? Because we do have to watch the clock a little.
Sure, I'm muted. Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Oh, wonderful. Well, first of all, I wanted to say good to see you guys again, Peter and John. It's always an inspiration to plug into this as an opportunity to learn something new. So I wanted to start by saying I'm not a big-time journalist, but the topic is of interest. I'm not even sure I'm a little-time journalist. However, I have a lot of experience with writing locally within my neighborhood here, writing for our neighborhood newsletter. And sometimes I struggle with that because that's not, I'm an engineer, I'm not a writer, but it does come out. But a couple things learned I just throw out here that somebody advised me on. When writing a newsletter, try to make it personal for the person who's reading it by including, for example, pictures or an actual quote that somebody said. It makes it more grabbing for somebody to hear your message when it comes across that way. I was also reminded of, at church, we often have somebody who stands up and makes announcements. Makes an announcement for your project and everybody else's project. The difference those announcements sound when the person who's in charge of the project makes the announcement. Doesn't that come across with a lot more enthusiasm and meaning when instead of somebody else just reading from a little announcement? So I think about that when writing locally, try to be personal with it. So stories by a journalist versus by the author whenever possible. I guess journalists can try to include the author's words as best as possible when they're doing. That's my thoughts for today. I appreciate hearing from you.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for bringing your face and your voice into this. So why don't we come back to the three of us. Becky, thanks.
Can I just ask how we can stay in touch with Paula if we want to evolve the conversation?
Sure. I don't know, Becky, what you sent out. I have an email address, paulalynellis@gmail.com.
And we can put that in the chat.
Yeah.
Leslie, if you can get that for us.
And
all right.
And Paula, you haven't advertised it, but you should. Everybody should know about your letters under what's the title? 2 Women and a Republic.
Oh yeah, 2 Women and a Republic. Letters Between Friends to Democracy. Wendy Willis and myself started this. It'll be a year in January. She's a poet and a deliberative democracy person, and myself. And so I owe her a letter Thursday. Every Thursday we exchange a letter about democracy, and the idea really is to bring in the cultural dimensions of it so that folks don't all think of everything as dull but important and boring and something other people do. We try to sort of normalize it in everyday culture. Thank you for mentioning that.
Thanks, and I'm gonna send you guys back as attendees and appreciate your engagement.
Thank you.
So any final thoughts, Paula? Anything that strikes you from this conversation?
No, I don't. I think that as you can tell, I'm just sort of foraging for partners. So for folks who these ideas are striking nerves, and like how journalism might be able to help create the space, generative space for people to solve problems, we're very interested in that. And then the just simple one that I was thinking of as Mary was talking also is that journalists only know what people tell them.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. They're regular people. We're trained in a certain way with a certain set of disciplines on what I won't get into, but what we know is what people tell us. Just, Peter, in the way that you tip the woman who you.
Yeah,
so that's it. That's the currency of the trade, is the relationships.
You know, I did have one thought, Paula, talk about relationship journalism. I think one of the things I've learned with John is the word hospitality, which is the welcoming of the stranger. And John talks sometimes about the tribal nature, but if you have, you know, a welcome at the edge. And so what I was hearing is you talking about telling stories that have a welcoming at the edge, and treat the stranger as somebody I need to understand. Otherwise, I'll never be surprised. And so the word hospitality just has a lot of meaning for me. Even when you hold a neighborhood gathering, I always had people sit with a stranger, and they're always irritated because they came to be with like-minded people. But if you make eye contact, they'll do it, and then they have a different experience. And I think that's what you're about. Is helping us get connected in that way, the communally. John, final thoughts, because we want to respect the time and Paula's time.
In the couple of minutes we have left, I want to ask Paula, because it's so important, everybody who's a listener should follow up on it. Well, she was at the Knight Foundation. They did a study called The Soul of Community, and I encourage you all to go and look at that. But Paula, can you tell us in a couple of minutes, what are the main factors that reflect whether or not people in a community feel attached to the place and each other?
Okay, and it's this attachment is psychological and emotional attachment. And what we were trying to discover is that an essential precondition for taking action in your community? And so the three elements that attach people to their community are: number one, is it an open and welcoming place? Number two, these aren't necessarily in rank order, but there are three. Number two is the aesthetics of the place, the sort of built environment and the natural environment. And when you see like folks picking up trash programs, that's speaking to this, the aesthetics. And then the third one is something that we called social offerings. So it's really social offerings and generalized caring. And what that means is places where we can meet, ways that we can kind of exchange and get to know each other. So those are the three. Oh, is it an open and welcoming place? Is it aesthetically pleasing? And does it have social offerings? And this research was done, 46,000 people surveyed over 3 years. And we kind of invented this new language to get the idea of engagement out of the sort of highly connotated areas that it was in. And to really just talk about psychological and emotional attachment potentially as a precondition for doing stuff. And there were about 16 things, including news, that didn't create attachment.
Really?
Until you came along.
Well, that I was just gathering evidence about why the shift is needed.
Well, you're making it. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
So quickly, we want to make sure that everyone is aware of our next call. This is our last call of 2018, but we will be back with Peter Block and John McKnight on January 16th. That's a Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, with a guest to be determined and announced soon. So we look forward to being back together with you in just a couple of months.
Thank you so much, Paula. John, you want to say a final word?
Yeah, Paula, it's been wonderful that you would take this time to join us. And again, I want to encourage people to look at your two women, say again, that
2 women and a republic.
that's the kind of discussion that connects in ways that builds a civic life that has respect and possibility. It's so valuable. Thank you.
Dang, I need you to do PR. Okay.
Yes, you do. You have them.
Thank you all. It was fun.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.